E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karanga maha o te wā, tēnā koutou. Nau mai haere mai ki te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa. Piki mai ki tō tātou whare, ko taiwhanga kauhau. Tēnā koutou i o koutou manaakitanga ki te kaupapa nei, a rā te kōrero a Lilburn. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening. My name is Chris CK. I am the Chief Librarian of the Alexander Turnbull Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to your National Library. I am also the Secretary of the Alexander Turnbull Library Endowment Trust and the Chairman of the Lilburn Trust Music Advisory Committee. And in those dual capacities, I am very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event, the 2022 Lilburn Lecture. Firstly, I need to convey apologies from the Chairman of the Alexander Turnbull Library Endowment Trust, Mr. John Meads. Unfortunately, John is unable to be with us this evening due to illness. Had he been here, he would have explained that the Endowment Trust is the sole trustee of the Lilburn Trust, and it is courtesy of the Lilburn Trust that this event is made possible. The Endowment Trust has received donations and bequests from generous New Zealanders and organisations for many decades. Tonight's lecture and myriad other activities are ways in which the Trust can acknowledge and give thanks for that generosity. Very shortly, I will be introducing our honoured speaker. Ross Harris will address us for around an hour, ably assisted by the music group, the Kugels. At the conclusion of the lecture, Ross will take his seat and Vincent O'Sullivan will approach the lectern to deliver the formal vote of thanks. As is the tradition with many formal memorial lectures, the floor will not be open for questions, but instead you are all invited to move to the first floor for refreshments and a reception in Ross's honour. This evening's reception is particularly special, as Ross will be presenting Lilburn citations, so do be sure to have a glass in hand to toast the worthy recipients. We have waited 2 years to get to this moment, so let's be sure to celebrate in fine style. And now, at last, to Ross Harris. Ross Harris is one of New Zealand's leading composers. He has written more than 200 compositions, including opera, symphonic music, chamber music, klezmer, and electronic music. Among his major works are the collaborations with Vincent O'Sullivan, including 2014 Requiem for the Fallen, a work described as devastating and a never-to-be-forgotten experience for those who attended. As someone who was in the audience at the Wellington premiere, I can certainly attest to that. Ross has been a finalist in the prestigious SOUNZ Contemporary Award more times than any other New Zealand composer, and won the award 4 times. Ross received a Queen's Service Medal in 1985 for his opera Waituhi, with libretto by Witi Ihimaera, the Cairns Citation for Services to New Zealand Music in 1990, and the Cairns Trust Fund Award in 2016. And now, in 2022, on the 107th anniversary of Douglas Lilburn's birth, he is here to deliver the Lilburn Lecture. Friends, please welcome Arts Laureate Ross Harris.
The high point of my career as a rugby player was when I was 10 years old and captain of the Beckenham Primary School rugby team, which played a local derby against Waltham. This was in Christchurch. I scored a try in that game by accidentally falling on the ball when it crossed over the opposition goal line. I refer to this historic moment because I came from a family for whom sport was very important. Both my father and brother played rugby reasonably seriously. I, on the other hand, was more of a sport of nature. A very late arrival in the family, and let's face it, a mistake. I was shy and oversensitive and most often described as a spoiled brat, to this day I suspect, and certainly ill-suited to rugby or much else until I discovered music much later. One time when I was very young, I was standing with my parents watching a Christmas parade or some such event when a pipe band started up right next to us. I burst into tears. Was I perhaps a budding music critic? No, just too sensitive to sounds, or indeed most things. My father was a stock agent and my mum a housewife who was not in good health from the day I was born. My much older brother and sister were involved in farming and my brother later in insurance. My sister trained as a hairdresser before marrying a Canterbury farmer. The family were typical Kiwis. They were honest, church-going and conservative. They were good people and I'm grateful for my relatively harmonious upbringing. But culture, the arts, art music simply didn't feature in our family lives. The culture of following our beloved Canterbury rugby team was about as near as we ever got. Strangely enough, my much older brother and sister had learnt the piano, but with such indifference that by the time I came along, my parents decided to sell the instrument. Now, here's the weird thing. While preparing this talk, I suddenly remembered improvising on this piano. It was a dark presence in our front room, and I don't remember anyone playing it, so for me, it was just a kind of miraculous sound machine. My parents must have heard me exploring the instrument in some disturbing manner and thought it best to get rid of it. I went away during the school holidays and came back to no more piano. My sister maintains that my musical education started with her. We always sang pop songs while doing the dishes. I always had to sing harmony. It was the same in church too, singing harmony when not giggling helplessly at something entirely inappropriate. With my brother and sister being 10 and 15 years older than me, I was more or less an only child. My childhood was spent playing with my toy cars, trains, planes, marbles arranged into armies or football teams. Thinking back on it, those imaginary worlds I created felt like the ones I inhabit when composing. Basically, I've always enjoyed the isolation necessary for writing music, just picking away on an instrument or poring over music paper, or these days, poking around on a computer. It's a bit like lining up my toys to go on some adventure or other. When I went to high school, a neighbour of mine said, "Join the school band and you won't have to carry a gun." I took his advice and went into the music room, and being a large lad, was given a B-flat bass, also known as a tuba. Very quickly, my life changed when I found I could actually do something. What a relief after my meagre academic results. My tuba playing got me into the National Youth Band, National Youth Orchestra, and acceptance into the 1962 National Band. Then I changed to the French horn for a 50-year battle with that hardest of all instruments, and mostly I came off second best. When I got hold of a B-flat bass, I immediately joined the Addington Workshops Brass Band and entered a competition after 2 weeks on the instrument and was awarded a prize in a melody section. I played Mozart's Oasis und Osiris. Some other members of the band were incensed by this upstart. In the third form at Christchurch Boys High, I met a boy who became my best friend for about 10 years. That was Gordon Burt, who later, for a time, lectured in music at Victoria University. I consider him a major influence on my intellectual development, such as it was at that time. We explored new music, modern art, movies, and literature together. Such was our dedication to contemporary music that we once literally had a physical fight in a record shop to see who would get a solitary box set of the music of Anton Webern. At some point during my early teens, I bought a bargain copy of Stravinsky conducting his early ballets. When I came home from school at that time, I'd lie with my ear right up against the radiogram speaker and listen to the music. I suppose I was avoiding upsetting my parents. I didn't understand the music at all, but for some mysterious reason, I really loved it. So what were these kids in their coarse textured school uniforms doing, pursuing this sort of thing? I don't know. Anyway, it was the path I took. And despite playing instruments professionally or semi-professionally throughout my career, tuba, French horn, accordion, and many other instruments, I always wanted to compose. From my earliest days of music, I was always heading manuscript pages with Symphony for Brass Band and the like, followed by blank pages. My first efforts were pathetic. One time I showed my brass instrument teacher, Merv Waters, something I'd written, and he said with great authority, "You've got consecutive fifths." Oh dear. I was horrified about the age 15, and I stopped composing for ages for fear of doing something else wrong. Another important person in my development was the music teacher at Christchurch Boys High, Clifton Cook. He was conservative and fanatical about music. He played a big part in my musical education, and once he actually gave me 6 of the best for playing clusters on the school music room piano. A modernist in the making, shall we say. At Canterbury University, one couldn't major in composition back then, so I muddled along by myself until my horn playing took me to Wellington to join the National Orchestra, and also started doing a master's degree in composition at Victoria University. After a year in the orchestra, I had the opportunity to become a temporary junior lecturer, so I gave up professional brass playing and became a teacher. But I've jumped ahead a little bit here. I was a big Lilburn fan, and it gives me great pleasure to be giving this lecture in his name. And for the end of my degree at Canterbury, I did a setting of Dennis Glover's Aotearoa Bill, poems for tenor, French horn, and strings. Not a million miles away, of course, from Lilburn's famous song cycle, Sings Harry. At the premiere of Aotearoa Bill, it took place in the Great Hall at Canterbury University, with Dennis Glover himself in the audience. Shortly after the piece began, Glover started groaning audibly, and before it was finished, he stood noisily and staggered out of the hall, mumbling as he went. At the time, I was pretty upset, as you can imagine, but I see now that it was all too arty for Glover's musical taste. And I'm sure poets often have a hard time with composers interpreting their work. It must be disturbing to have another artist's mind imposed on their art. During my undergraduate years at Canterbury, a group of Canterbury students decided to visit Wellington to see the famous music studio, the music department, and meet Douglas Lilburn and the electronic music studio. Vic was greatly admired for having actual composers on the staff and actually supporting new music. When I finished my degree at Canterbury, I had the opportunity to move to Wellington after that. My wife and I left Christchurch, and I started and finished my career as a horn player in the National Orchestra in 1969. I carried on as an extra for about 15 years, playing big symphonic works when they needed more than the standard number of horns. So there was Mahler, Bruckner, Wagner, Stravinsky, huge orchestral pieces, and I'm sitting right in the middle of these performances and rehearsals, time after time, learning a huge amount, especially about orchestration, I think. This may be the reason why I got so interested in writing symphonies later on. So I started my master's degree part-time while playing the horn and joined the university staff in 1970. I did electronic music with Douglas Lilburn and instrumental music with David Farquhar. With the arrogance of youth, I didn't take advantage of David's tuition, but I was keen to work with Douglas in the electronic studio. I realised that in following Lilburn into electronic music, I was consciously looking to find sounds that could be considered as part of our cultural and natural background. In fact, to write music, New Zealand music, as Lilburn had defined it in his Cambridge lectures. At that time, the studio was possibly the only one of its kind in Australasia. For a period of time, from the mid-1960s to the mid-70s, the Vic Studio became a destination for young composers from other centres. There's John Cousins from Canterbury and John Rimmer from Auckland, for example. Douglas didn't teach composition in the studio, but led by example. From him, one learned to treat the equipment with respect and to spend many hours searching for the right sound, the next good sound that you needed, and of course, using the sounds around us. It was partly because of the basic nature of the studio in the early days that one was likely to begin with already existing sounds. New Zealand birds, of course, were a hot favourite, as was the composer's own voice. The equipment in the studio came from cast-off gear from Radio New Zealand, some oscillators, modulators, filters, huge tape recorders, and a very important brand new reverberation plate. If you played Douglas a piece of music in progress, watch out for him lighting up a cigarette. That was a bad sign. Douglas did this once when I was working on the piece To a Child. I was in the process of possibly producing New Zealand's first minimalist composition, but it got snuffed out under the influence of a cigarette. So in the end, I've remained largely self-taught. I didn't go overseas to study, as was expected of serious music students at this time. I had a young family and didn't feel very fully confident in my compositional prowess to commit to such a move. Later, two subjects I taught at Vic became crucial for my development as a composer. Counterpoint, surprise, Schenkerian analysis, and like Schoenberg, I would say I learned from my students. Even so, I had a lack of confidence which stayed with me to the extent that when in the 1980s I was awarded a QSM for the opera Waituhi, I had doubts about whether I was the right person being awarded. At the presentation at Government House, I seriously thought for a moment that I might have been mistaken for an opossum hunter from the Wairarapa, another Ross Harris. I knew about such a person because he'd been some confusion over tax returns at an earlier time. When the electronic music studio moved from the basement of the Hunter building to 44 Kelburn Parade, Douglas and my offices were adjacent and on the same floor as the studios. This is where I overheard him in his long battle to find sounds that were meaningful to him. Some indication of the kind of battle he had with the equipment, voltage-controlled synthesizers they were, as that he actually created a piece called Lilburn versus Putney, not as one of his major works, but as an experimental piece to show that he was in the process of coming to terms with how this gear worked, which was very complex. Not so much complex, but rather irrational, because the little oscillators and stuff could drift out of tune and then change everything enormously. But I'll tell you that the pieces he composed during that decade in the 1970s were a profoundly important contribution to New Zealand music. What a fight he had to get those pieces right. I've already mentioned that I was committed to being a New Zealand composer in the Lilburn sense, using electronic music to create something that literally belonged here. But I also became interested in using fragments of other composers' music. Electronic pieces like To a Child and Shadow Music created dialogue with Mahler and Berg in the case of those pieces. My focus was shifting away from New Zealand music and Lilburn's influence. My second piece in the studio was To a Child. In it, I quoted the children's choir movement from Mahler's Third Symphony. I'd chosen this because it had been played at the funeral of my daughter Victoria, who had died a few days after her birth. There's a child's voice in this piece too. It's a recording of my 2-year-old son Julian, now in his 50s, improvising in the style of Stockhausen's piece Stimmung. Stockhausen's piece includes a sort of European version of Tibetan throat singing, and I'll try and imitate for a moment. If I get close to the mic, it'll be better. You're supposed to be able to hear the harmonics and so forth. So here is an excerpt, oops, fight my way into my machine, from To a Child. Okay, so deliberate borrowing of ideas from other composers has become a bit of a theme in my work, and quite a few commission pieces have required the deliberate influence of other composers' music. Perhaps the most obvious example are the three pieces for orchestra commissioned by Peter and Catherine Walls for the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra's tour of Europe in 2010. The pieces used fragments of Mahler, Wagner and Schumann. In 1971, in the second year of my master's degree, I started a 33-year-long teaching career at Victoria University. My composing life gradually developed within the university environment. I wrote mostly for students and staff. Of the more than 100 pieces that I wrote during that time, there were very few commissions. It was largely in-house. It was partly because of being a well-paid academic. Arts Council funding was frowned on, and my composing was accepted as research at this time, so it was funded within the university environment. This isolated environment was, of course, very conducive to experimenting in all sorts of things, which one wasn't dependent on making a living, for example. One example of something a little bit extreme is the band Free Radicals. What's that doing in an academic environment, you'd have to wonder. The late Jonathan Besser and I formed a live electronic ensemble with the guitarist, flute player Jerry Meister, and for about 10 years in the 80s and early 90s we performed and recorded as Free Radicals. The name was taken from the Len Live film, of course. The musical language we inhabited owed something to Stockhausen or Kraftwerk or Tangerine Dream, that sort of thing. We adopted new technology like drum machines, synthesizers, and wrote rock-influenced music. Many Free Radical pieces involved some commentary on New Zealand. One of my favourites, I have to say, is called Drive It. Drive It was the line-out call of Sean Fitzpatrick, the All Black hooker at the time. It's a collage of war and sport-related samples, including Winston McCarthy broadcasting an All Black Springbok game with its characteristic phrase, "Wait for it, it's a goal," and soccer parents screaming at their children. The excerpt that I will play starts near the end of the piece after a long build-up, which I won't put you through. But you'll hear Jonathan scratching on a record of Winston McCarthy's speech, and yes, various other bits and pieces. It's fairly chaotic, so. That's some kind of New Zealand music for you. During my time at Victoria University, I wrote 3 very ambitious operas. The first of these was Waituhi, 1984, with a libretto by Witi Ihimaera. The opera is based on one of his early books, Whānau, and the director, Adrian Kiernander, knew both Witi and I, and knew that we wanted to write operas and brought us together. Writing Waituhi took about 4 years, and I had to become seriously involved in the Māori world. Quite a lot of the libretto was in Māori, so I had to learn and teach myself to set te rao. The work caused a stir for the novelty of putting the Maori village on an operatic stage, and I picked up an alarming amount of white hair conducting it. Many of the performers had never performed with a conductor or an orchestra. The performances were often hair-raising for me to keep together. On one occasion, the RNZ engineers recording the work were quite sure it would all fall apart, as the orchestra and those on stage got so far apart. Somehow I managed to hold it together, maybe conducting 2 different speeds at the same time. I don't actually recall. Here's the wedding chorus from the beginning of Act 4 of Waituhi. The second opera that I wrote with Witi was Tanz de Schwärne, The Dance of the Swans, which was premiered in 1993. While Waituhi was about Witi's world, Tanz was more about my world. I had met my second wife in the mid-1970s, and as a European living in a foreign country, there were some parallels between her and the tragic female role in Tanz. Barbara was often made aware of her otherness, not always a bad thing, of course. The opera was about a Jewish woman who came to New Zealand as a refugee, only to find discrimination and brutality here. Leslie Graham was the lead singer in both of these operas, and she gave her all to perform these difficult expressionist roles. Although there was some small payment to a handful of performers, they were largely amateur productions based around the university support and university performers. That was the pattern of my writing music for people around me during this period. The third opera I tackled during these years was A Wheel of Fire. It was based on Shakespeare's King Lear, I had made my own libretto, which was probably a mistake. And although it was close to being performed at a festival around that time, it got beaten to it by a gender reversal version of Lear and languishes in the bottom drawer, and I don't think it's ever going to come out. At the end of my time at the university, I wrote 2 more pieces written for Vic staff and students, and they were important, I think, to my development. One of them was the monodrama to the memory of I.S. Totska, which featured the soprano Susan Roper, and the other was Music for Johnny, written for the VUW String Orchestra. Totska won the SOUNZ Contemporary Award in 2001, and this gave me courage to take early retirement a couple of years later. That decision was a major turning point in my work. Combined with winning the award and having a couple of residencies, I launched into major works, 7 symphonies, violin, cello and tuba concertos, operas and chamber music. It was a bit like the floodgates opening, and with the zigzag creative path of my university years behind me, I started to free up my musical language. The idea of Totska was based on the idea of Totska came from a BBC television programme called The Nazis, A Lesson from History. Ilse Sonja Totska was a shy woman who was reported by her neighbours for being antisocial. She was sent to a concentration camp. She was just one tiny voice in this whole programme, but the work is a tribute to this lonely woman about whom almost nothing is known. I constructed the libretto from English subtitles, so there were excerpts of many different languages in the piece. When I tried to get copyright for the words from the BBC, they took a long time and eventually gave up and said, you can use it. It's just too much to sort out. The ensemble included all instruments that I could play, accordion, tuba, guitar, and lots of other as well, and basically represented a kind of little German band. The words from the excerpt that you will hear are these. About 7 or 8 people were hanging from the gallows. Their feet were tied together with stones attached to them. They were lowered slowly, so they would die a slow death. The other piece was Music for Johnny. This was written in memory of a nephew of mine who had died at a young age. I'd hoped that the directness of the tonal language might be something my sister, who had lost her son, might be able to relate to. In my final research leave year from the university, I collaborated for the first time with Vincent O'Sullivan on an opera based on Rasputin's bringing down of Tsarist Russia. Why not? Called Black Ice. One aspect of the story of Rasputin was the use of a phonograph to simulate the sounds of a party going on in the Yusupov Palace. This was to lure Rasputin to the party and to his death by poisoning. An actual phonograph was used, and it was a recording of the song Yankee Doodle Dandy. I think this was the thing that stimulated Vincent's interest in doing this piece, and the phonograph is imitated in the opera, of course. Black Ice is a big opera with many soloists and chorus. It was a great subject for an opera, but probably not the topic to interest New Zealand opera in particular. It has not been performed. My second collaboration with Vincent was a bit more practical, shall we say, in the Second Symphony. It was written as part of a residence with the Auckland Philharmonia. I wrote the soprano solo part for Madeleine Pirard, and she's been the soloist in all 6 performances to date. The work's germination came from a newspaper article about the official pardoning of a young New Zealand soldier who'd been court-martialed and shot during World War I. He'd gone AWOL and met and fell in love with a French woman. This is the basis of the narrative, which is woven into the 4-movement symphonic structure. Here is the opening of the slow movement. I established a remarkable and I believe fairly unique relationship with the Auckland Philharmonia, which premiered all symphonies 1 to 6. They were all written for them and have number 7 on their schedule for 2023. They also premiered my cello concerto, the oratorio Face, and a celebratory piece for the 25th anniversary of the orchestra called Cento, which the NZSO is going to be playing in their next year's programme. I would like to play one complete musical example, but I might be a bit long on time. The second scherzo from my 5th symphony is what I have in mind. The words in this work are by the Hungarian poet Pani Palaszti, who lived in Nelson. It's the story of a 10-year-old girl in Budapest in the 1940s. The movement which we're going to hear, not all of, I fear, is the nightmare scenario of an individual shot and dying alone during the war. There is no voice in this movement. This is the APO, all guns blazing. will leave it there. The next project that Vincent and I worked on was commissioned by Voices New Zealand with funding from Creative New Zealand, Requiem for the Fallen. Vincent's brilliant text combined words of the Latin Requiem with words about a New Zealand soldier's horrific experiences of war. The composition acknowledged the creative contribution of Taongapuro player Horomona Horo, who has a percentage of the royalties. The other forces were Voices New Zealand, the New Zealand String Quartet, bass drum player R. Harris, and Richard Grieger, who sang the role of an old soldier thinking back in times of war. I'm going to play two shortish musical examples. The first one is the DA0, which features Horomona on the pukaya, which is the big trumpet. And the next example is from the Requiem Aeternum, the end, and it's got Horomona performing on the kawao and the puterino. The kawao is the flute, quite high, and the puterino in this case is underneath the string quartet in a very haunting piece of composing by Horomona. Couldn't have written that part. In many of the pieces that Vincent and I have done together, he has come up with incredibly interesting topics. On many occasions, I've been pushed in directions I wouldn't otherwise have followed. The oratorio Face, for example, based on New Zealand surgeons' development of plastic surgery in the First World War, would be such an example. So far, it's been a very fruitful collaboration, and thanks to Creative New Zealand, there's another opera in the pipeline. I've mentioned a close relationship I had with the APO. There's also another group that I've written a lot for, the New Zealand String Quartet, who were colleagues of mine at the School of Music and personal friends. There are 10 string quartets, a piano quintet, a quintet for double bass, Requiem for the Fallen, the Abiding Tides for string quartet and soprano, as well as a number of pieces for separate members of the group. One of the most notable, I believe, is Chaconne for solo viola, and there's a little bit of a story to tell about the first performance of this. It was commissioned to be performed at the Adam Chamber Music Festival by an international violist, Aotearoa. I wrote the piece and sent it off to him, but I didn't hear back anything back from him. With a couple of weeks to the performance, I got a message saying that he couldn't play it. The first page was impossible. Gillian from the quartet bravely stepped up, learnt the piece, and in his concert, he marched off the stage. Gillian came on, played my piece beautifully, and then he came back on and finished his concert. The funny thing is that I composed the first page with a viola in my hand. I had in mind certain images of refugees wandering along the roads of Europe in the world wars, and I wanted to get the viola to sound like a wonky balalaika. Our international star either couldn't get his hands into the same positions as I did, or he so disapproved of the piece that he refused to learn it. Here's just a little bit of Chaconne for solo viola. And here's another example with the full string quartet playing the opening of my ninth string quartet, which it requires the players to hum and play the instruments in unison with themselves. Quite a difficult thing to do, I might say. Another musical adventure began around the time of the Second Symphony. I was invited to join a klezmer band by Robin Perks and other friends. They asked me because I had a little accordion that I'd used in some Free Radicals tracks. This was about 2005. I went to a rehearsal not knowing what to expect. I even had to check the spelling on the web. Immediately I took to the genre, which offered me a number of things. The chance to play more accordion, because my horn playing was tailing off, and I still wanted to play. Access to an idiom with folk origins, and a chance to write music in a simple form of melody and chords. Many of the pieces of klezmer music, which have come from obviously East European, probably through New York, where people wrote them down, are available for people to read and play, and we are classical musicians reading and playing. But the music can be just a tune and some chords, like a pop music chart, and that requires quite a different approach to composing from, say, writing a full symphony orchestra with heaps of things going on all at the same time and all connected beautifully in some magical way. So that was an important thing. And in fact, and also then I would say the Jewish connection. I'd become increasingly interested in Jewish history after my research into the opera Tanz des Ferne, and I'd always loved the rich complexity and ambiguity of Jewish artists and composers, Mahler and Schoenberg, for example, and favourite authors like Daniel Mendelssohn and Timothy Schneider. It is my hope that in writing klezmer music, because I am not Jewish, can be thought of as expressing compassion and empathy for the appalling history of the Jewish people. Something happened when I started working with the Kugels. I found that I had an instant sounding board of for new pieces. The band would generously tackle new works as soon as I had written them, quite amazing, and quite different from waiting years, if not forever, for a performance. Having written over 50 pieces for them, including 10 songs now setting the Yiddish language, the Kugels have started to change my language of my more serious pieces as well. So I'm very lucky to invite the Kugels to play one of my short songs tonight. Step forward, team. We will play a setting of a Yiddish poem, Die Kriege geht. The ice flow is moving. Poet David Hofstein. The words, or a summary of the words, are: beautiful and treacherous, the river gives and takes life. The frozen surface of the river melts and the ice flow begins to move. The players are Robin Perks. Where's he gone? Seppical. Debbie Rawson, clarinet, Anna Gorn, voice, Nick Tipping, bass, and I'm on accordion. I have a little bit more to say. I spent the 2020 lockdown writing an opera based on Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. The libretto was beautifully crafted by my great friend Adrian Kernander. Tragically, he died after a long illness on the same day as I finished the score. It is yet to be performed. To summarise, writing music is a journey of self-discovery or delusion, and I can't really can't live properly without doing it. You could say it's a fairly harmless addiction, although I'm sure there are performers out there who would consider the music potentially harmful, both physically and mentally. So here I am presenting at this unlikely present, somewhat surprised to have collected a body of work, for whatever it is worth, and surprised to find that despite my occasional reaction against writing music that belongs here, quite a lot of it does seem to. At the premiere recently of my chamber symphony, audience members at a Q&A session were sure they were listening to New Zealand music. As well as overtly local themes, the New Zealand experience of World War I, Requiem for the Fallen, Brass Poppies, Symphony No. 2, there's New Zealand history, plastic surgery, the Waihi strike, New Zealanders, Alexander Aitken, Beatrice Tinsley, and titles like Waituhi, Aotearoa Te Manapori, Symphony No. 4 to the memory of Mahina Rangitoka, Landscape with Too Few Lovers after a painting by Colin McCann. But then there are pieces about Chagall and Tsarist Russia, the Holocaust, settings of Yiddish, German, French, Swedish, Japanese, Celtic and Latin. I've never pushed my work forward, but I've been very lucky to have people like Douglas Lilburn, Jack Boddy, Peter Walls and many others supporting and encouraging me. There really was a feeling of uncertainty about the worth of it in the early years. More recently, I've come to accept that whatever it's worth, it is actually what I do, a bit each day digging away to find the next note. Composing requires a lot of technical knowledge, of course, but in my experience, the day-to-day decisions often seem to be irrational or intuitive. Somehow the brain churns away under the surface, and it's important to give it time to operate without too many day-to-day distractions. Anyway, I guess I've done what I've always said to my students. Don't be put off if your music's considered irrelevant in the current climate. Do it anyway. I feel very privileged to have been able to devote my life to this weird thing of writing music. I love composing and feel very uncomfortable when I have a gap between pieces. My family has always supported my writing, although they've had to put up with some distractions of thinking up music occasionally. And then there are the dogs. Sylvia, Sammy, Mokipai, Harry, Katie, and now Simon and Dolly, who'll be waiting anxiously at home for our return tonight. I'll give my last word to my dad. When he learned that I might pursue a career in music, he reckoned I'd end up on a park bench. Not so far. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much to the Lilburn Trust and the Alexander Turnbull for the privilege of asking me to say just a few closing words. Particularly, I should say this, in that in a room full of people who know so much about music, I truly am the man in the street. And to bear out my credentials, when I first arrived at Victoria in the early 60s and had morning tea for the first time with Freddie Page, he said to me, "I can see you know nothing about music. We'll get on splendidly." And now there is so much to thank you for, Ross. This enthralling hour that you've just graced us with. To those of us who do not have the gift to compose music, it seems a remarkable one. To be so at home in the great traditions of music and to attend to that, and at the same time bringing the fresh demands of your time, your country, your personality, and bringing sounds into existence that were not there before and would not be there were it not for you. A composer, you could say, has the keys to enter that great repository, but what he comes out with is peculiarly his own. He is always telling us how he has listened to the past, while he is giving us so much that could not have been heard without him, and only because of him, and also composing, I always think with you, Ross, almost sort of on behalf of the country as well. When Ross mentioned to me quite some time ago how honoured he felt to be asked to give this prestigious lecture, it wasn't said with the kind of lift that I expected. It was more as if it was some kind of medical procedure that he couldn't get out of having. And of the artists I admire, I don't know any so reluctant to talk about himself. If ever there was an artist who is inclined to say, never mind about me, just look at the work, it's Ross. And one of the, if I might just for a moment say this, Ross, one of the privileges of my lifetime as a writer has been to work with you. And it's been such a congenial experience. It's done sort of rather quickly always with phone calls and visits to a Puni Street. And as my wife says, for people who seem to laugh a lot on the phone and talk mainly about cricket and rugby, you manage to get a lot of people killed. So, and that's a compliment I think she means to your music. So, now I've loved hearing that story tonight, Ross, about your sort of the odyssey of your writing life, and what came through, particularly to me, was the sense of vocation, the drive of your commitment that was there from a child's fiddling with clock chimes to sound different from how others had set them. I love to think of you as a, well, it's not too late, I suppose, set clock chimes again. It's one of the few things you wouldn't have done. And also, what I so admired was the utter certainty, since you were a 3-year-old, that what interested you most in life was how things sounded. And to follow out a lifetime totally to making sound your life and to making your own sounds ours as well as yours. That finding music, I think it was especially as our own, as Lilburn himself said many years ago, we are tentatively doing. And you surely, as one of his pupils, are as strong an example as we could get of what came from Lilburn's beginnings. And that other fact you've so reminded us of, the extraordinary range of what you've composed, the great traditional forms, your experimental work, the vast range of your instrumental and vocal scores, the songs in several languages, your exuberant klezmer, And among the many things I'm in your debt for is that you never quite accept that there is any topic that can't be set to music in some way. Soon after we met, thanks to Peter Walls, I rather stupidly teased you when we were talking of something we might do. And I said, what about I'll write some words for a duet for xylophone and tuba. And you said, if I could think of a reason why, then why not? So, speaking for your audience tonight, what is also central to the swoop and range and depth of your music is another music, what Wordsworth called the music of humanity. Your concern in music with what is most important outside music. To move a vote of thanks is so little a thing for the largesse you have given us all, as a composer and, of course, as a performer as well. And thanks, I think, that go way back, I think, to how grateful we all will always be to the pipe band in Ashburton that made a little boy cry. So it's an honour indeed, Ross, to thank you for so much. Thank you.